At this time, we have a very special opportunity. One of the great gifts of being Bishop of the San Antonio area at this time and the Rio Texas Conference is to have Bishop Joel Martinez be in residence as retired bishop here in San Antonio. I can think of no one who I appreciate more in terms of friendship, guidance, support, serving as a confidant and a mentor than Bishop Joel Martinez. He has been of great service not only to the Rio Grande Conference and the Southwest Texas Conferences, but to me personally and to the Rio Texas Conference. Bishop Martinez is here with us today. He is going to present our teacher for the afternoon, and I want to say just a deep word of gratitude for Bishop Martinez, who he is, how he leads, and what he does. I, at this moment, want to present to you your former bishop, Bishop Joel Martinez.
I'm glad that Bishop Dorff came to this Episcopal area. I prayed for that, and I think the Lord answered my prayer and many others. I think he's been a blessing to all of us, a friend, spiritual leader, a good counselor in the circles of the Council of Bishops. And so I celebrate his ministry and Barbara's ministry among us, just demonstrated a few minutes ago with Project Transformation and her leadership on the board of Lydia Patterson. I could say more. Sisters and brothers, our presenter in a moment is Dr. Paul Barton. Dr. Barton has deep United Methodist roots. His great-grandfather, Maximo Villarreal, was one of the pioneer circuit riders and preachers in the 19th and 20th centuries in the mission with and among Hispanic people on this border. His father, Roy Barton, was an esteemed colleague of many of us for over 40 years in the journey of ministry in the Rio Grande Conference and throughout the church. His mother, Rosa Marina, was a saintly and joyous woman, servant of Jesus Christ, who died very recently, and we memorialized her last evening. Paul has been teaching and serving at the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest for a number of years, and just this year, just a few weeks ago, he was invited to serve at Perkins School of Theology to direct the Mexican-American program, also Hispanic Latino Center, and to direct the intern program, the course of study program as well. And Bishop Dorff wisely agreed to appoint him to that, and we're celebrating that for Paul, for the seminary, and for the United Methodist Church. Let me say that Paul will say more about a forthcoming book that he is soon to be published that will be shared with all of you, courtesy of the bishop's office and the conference for all delegates, clergy and lay of this conference. He'll say more about that, but a committee that I have been working with over time has sponsored that book in collaboration with the General Commission on Archives and History. Earlier today, we distributed a booklet on the timeline of the historical journey of the Rio Grande Conference. If you've done any reading in it, those of you that have it, there's a lot of intersections with leadership and churches and communities that are also your forebears in the former Southwest Texas Conference. We've been together on this journey in this space for a long time. So I invite Dr. Barton to come forward and share with us at this time.
Stopwatch. Bishop Dorff and the Annual Conference Agenda Committee, thank you for inviting me to address you and the new Rio, Texas Conference. I appreciate the privilege that you've given me as I talk about the history of the Rio Grande Conference, which is now part of the Rio, Texas Conference. On this inaugural session of the Rio, Texas Conference, I've discovered that everyone wants to be a historian.
Amen.
In fact, 3 times during this session, other speakers unknowingly covered the same parts of the lecture that I was going to cover today. Reverend Bill Noble highlighted the story of the Reverend Policarpio Rodriguez and Polly's Chapel. And last night, Bishop Minerva Carcaño highlighted the story of Reverend Alejo Hernandez. And this morning, Reverend John Fagans again spotlighted Policarpio Rodriguez. So I have nothing more to say. No, I do. Sorry. No, I have plenty to say. But you'll hear about Alejo Hernandez and Policarpio Rodriguez again in this talk. I recognize that any historical account of history is subjective. There is no such thing as objective history. And another person standing here would include different items in the story that I'm going to give you today. I also recognize that I might have a date that is wrong, or that there might be something I left out that I should have included. So please feel free to send me your comments. I'm not sure if, I can't see if there is a PowerPoint presentation that has my information. Is that correct? Are you seeing it up there? There it is. Look for the section that right before that has my info. Well, I'll give it to you right here, which is my email address beginning at Perkins is pbarton@mail.smu.edu, and I'm giving that to you because I solicit your comments. If I made an error, I want to make sure I correct that for future sake, and I'd like to hear from you what you thought about this talk. So my email address again is pbarton@mail.smu.edu. As also I mentioned, as Bishop Joel mentioned, Bishop Joel Martinez, as of July the 1st, I will be the incoming director of the Mexican American and Hispanic Latino Church Ministries program and the Regional Course of Study School and professor of Church History and Mission. And I would like to extend an invitation to you to visit me whenever you are at Perkins School of Theology. I would be happy to talk with you if you're interested in preparation for ministry in Hispanic settings, if you're interested in attending the course of study, or just interested in thinking about entering into the ordained ministry. Now, a few thank yous that I need to offer at the beginning. I would like to thank the Committee for the Study of the Hispanic Latino Church for inviting me to write this new history of the Rio Grande Conference. A few years ago, the Bishop Joel Martinez was very concerned about the fact that many of our elder Hispanic leaders from throughout Methodism in our country were sadly getting to the point where they were going to be departing us because of their age. So Bishop Martinez, on his own effort, went about conducting oral histories. And after a while, he realized that he needed some institutional support for that. And so this committee formed to help him do that. And Bishop Martinez has conducted over 100 oral histories of Hispanic Methodists in order to make sure that we have the record of the history of Hispanic Methodism from throughout our denomination. And that is what spawned this committee for the study of Hispanic Latino church study. And then out of that, they decided that it would be very important to commemorate the beginning of the new Rio, Texas conference with a new book on the history of the former Rio Grande conference. And so the idea was that you would have in your hands today this new history of the Rio Grande conference. And I confess to you my sin that I did not get that book done in time, but I'm hoping that we can have it be in your hands for next year. And then I also want to thank Bishop Dorff, because he is the person who is going to make that book available to every delegate free of charge. Now, I also want to thank the members of this committee for the study of Hispanic and Latino history. And the members are here up on the stage. First, Reverend Dr. David Maldonado. He is the chair. If you'd stand up, please. And Bishop Joel Martinez, who helped get this whole thing off the ground. And the Reverend Fred Day, who is the General Secretary of Archives and History and has been supporting this committee and is a member of it. Dr. Justo Gonzalez of the Rio, Texas Conference. Reverend Edgar Avitia of the Rio, Texas Conference. Dr. Daniel Flores of the Rio, Texas Conference. Dr. Liz Lopez of the Minnesota Conference. Reverend Teresa Santillan of the California Pacific Conference. And not here today, but also in the committee is Dr. Hugo Magallanes of the South Georgia Conference and Dr. Aida Fernandez of the New England Conference. So thank you very much for the support that you have given. Thank you. I've actually been commissioned by this committee to write this book, and so I am humbled by the fact that the General Commission of Archives and History and this particular committee had confidence in me and the ability to do this. And I also want to thank a few persons who have been very helpful to me as I've developed this presentation today. As Bishop Martinez mentioned, the committee commissioned me to write this new history. And I want to thank as well other persons who helped me to create or find the information for this presentation. Among those persons, the Reverend Edgar Avitia, and also the Reverend John Fagans, and Dr. David Maldonado. And also thank you to Austin Newton for helping with the development of the photos and this PowerPoint presentation. Go ahead. Now I'll switch to paper. Okay, unification. Perfect, Austin. Thank you. So, unification gives the people of the San Antonio Episcopal area the opportunity to redefine who we are as United Methodists. The fine print down there will tell you that that is from, anybody recognize it? From the Rio, Texas Unification Plan. So this is a statement that was written by the leaders of the persons who joined together for the unification team, and they said that. They said, unification gives the people of the San Antonio Episcopal area the opportunity to redefine who we are as United Methodists. So we are redefining who we are as United Methodists, and we have been doing that throughout this conference. But what does that really mean? Because in reality, we do not define ourselves. Rather, it is God who defines who we are as the body of Christ. We do not define ourselves. Rather, we listen for God in order to remember who we are as we remember our baptism, as we just did earlier today in our worship service. We are one body in Christ. All of us share in Christ's death and resurrection. Who we are, first of all, is the body of Christ. Having said this, we are in a kairos movement in which we seek guidance from God to move into the future. In fact, I have heard some persons, interesting, not at this conference, but last year and in other times, I've heard persons say that we should not look to the past, but we must look forward with hope and courage and enthusiasm. Well, I believe we have time to do both. We have time to look back at our heritage while using the insights from the past to guide us in our decision-making about the future of our conference. After all, we look back on our past every time we worship and have communion. In the communion service, we combine the past, the present, and the future. Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. The first Christians looked back on their Jewish heritage as they interpreted Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promise of a Messiah. So as Christians, our past is crucial to our identity, just as our past helps propel us into our future. And pertaining to our Methodist identity, how could we call ourselves Methodists and Wesleyans if we did not look back in history to learn about the faithful witness of John and Charles and Susanna Wesley? So while we are certainly at a point in our history that offers much hope for the future and requires strategizing for the future, we would be like a ship without ballast if we did not take time to understand and appreciate our heritage. The next slide. So to achieve a successful unification, it is critically important that each conference honor its traditions and strengths to make this unification advantageous. That also was in the unification plan that we adopted. Because we are two conferences that have come to a confluence and have become one, it is important for this new conference to incorporate and appreciate the history of both previous conferences. So while I greatly appreciate the bishops and the Agenda Committee's invitation to present a history of the Rio Grande Conference, it's also important to give time next year to lift up the history of the Southwest Texas Conference. So the history I'm presenting to you is not a history only for the members of the former Rio Grande Conference, but rather it is a history that now belongs to the new Rio Texas Conference, a history that belongs to all of us. And while the purpose of my talk is to share with you the traditions of the mostly Mexican and Mexican-American Methodists, it's my hope that this talk will advance the mission of our conference through examining our tradition. This is not a history simply in terms of telling what happened like a series of facts. Rather, this is a history that I hope will provoke us to think about how we engage in mission today and for the future. And to do this, I want to overlay the structure of this new Mission Vitality Center with the history of the Rio Grande Conference. Here are the four components of the Mission Vitality Center: the Media Center, which has to do with uniting peoples through improved communication through technology and media, and congregational vitality, and leadership vitality, and then outreach vitality, which also deals with transforming communities. So page 11 of the Unification Report says, the Unification Implementation Team affirmed the existing United Methodist mission statement for the new conference, which is, the mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The UIT identified a vision to guide the unification and the work of the new conference in order to achieve the mission of our church, which is, one, uniting peoples, vitalizing congregations, developing leaders, and transforming communities. And I also want to talk about the key characteristics of mission and how these key characteristics of mission were manifest in the history of the Rio Grande Conference, and particularly for this talk, the earliest part of that history. So mission is certainly not limited to, but mission involves the following characteristics: leadership, passion, vocation, discernment, prayer, listening, suffering, risk, celebration, institutional support, relationship, and finally, crossing borders. So as we learn about the history of the Rio Grande Conference, we are learning about the ways that the church has been in mission to a particular group of people. And we are learning about how a particular group of people have responded to God's call to share Jesus Christ with the Spanish-speaking in this region. So I want us to consider this question: what kind of leadership that was needed for the mission among the Spanish-speaking in the Southwest in the 1800s and the early 1900s, what kind of leadership was used then, and now what kind of leadership is used and needed now? That's an important question that the Board of Ordained Ministry needs to consider, and for the conference vitalizing teams to consider. Mission is the work of the church, so what kind of institutional support was given back then in the 1800s and the early 1900s? And now what kind of institutional support needs to be given today? And by institutional support, I mean strategizing appointments for mission, based on mission, financial budgets, mobilizing laypersons, developing wonderful new programs like Project Transformation, supporting laypersons and volunteers and staffing. So yes, institutional support is very important for mission. But mission is also about relationship. So I also want to ask the question, what was the nature of the relationship between Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Anglo and Euro-Americans in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now the 21st century? And how has that complicated relationship between these groups changed over time? And then we can ask these same questions about these other characteristics that I talked about as well. How have people suffered in different ways in the 18th century, or the 1800s, 1900s, and today? So now I'm going to organize the rest of this presentation by overlaying 3 of the 4 components of the Mission Vitality Center with the chronological history of the Rio Grande Conference. They are outreach, leadership, and uniting peoples. And I apologize to Bob Williams and the Vitalizing Congregations team because I simply was not able to include this component into the presentation due to the time constraints. It was not possible to effectively cover all 4 of those components, although that has nothing to do with the value of it. Let me get some water. So, outreach, transforming communities. The first forms of mission consisted of individuals who felt called by God or sent by God to share the gospel with the Spanish-speaking in the first half of the 19th century. Laypersons were the first to bring the Protestant faith to the Spanish-speaking in the borderlands. Initially, outreach was done by individuals who felt called by God to minister to the Spanish-speaking. Persons like the layman David Ayers, who arrived by boat at San Patricio, Texas from New York in 1834, even before Texas independence. And as soon as he got there, he brought with him this box of Bibles and Sunday school books in Spanish. As soon as he got there, he began distributing these Bibles and these books among the Spanish-speaking in San Patricio and then elsewhere in the area. And then unfortunately, the Catholic priest became aware of what he was doing, and he got in trouble, and they burned the books in Spanish, and he had to move to another location for his own safety. So that gives you some indication of sometimes mission involves opposition and conflict. Then William Heaton was another layman from the Methodist Church right here in Corpus Christi, who reached out to Mexicans and Mexican Americans. He was an immigrant from Ireland, and he learned Spanish and eventually led a Spanish-speaking language Sunday school at First UMC in Corpus Christi. And he also interpreted the Sunday sermon to them in Spanish. A historian, H.G. Horton, wrote of William Heaton, "He would bring many Mexican men and women to our church, often interpreting the words of the preacher to them. His zeal for the spread of the gospel among the Mexicans was active and intelligent, distributing Spanish tracts and holding meetings with them." So Heaton and Ayres are a testament to the calling that a few individual laypersons had towards evangelistic ministry with the Spanish-speaking in Texas, first during Mexican sovereignty and then after Texas independence. Now we'll move on to the very first conference, the Rio Grande Mission Conference in 1859. There are only a handful of instances of Anglo-American Methodists demonstrating an interest in sharing the gospel with Mexicans and Mexican Americans during this time. The first instance of the Rio Grande Mission Conference, which was the first name given to the conference that eventually became the Southwest Texas Conference, going on record of considering ministry among the Spanish-speaking was in that first conference in 1859. The General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church had also authorized, my text is a little wrong here, excuse me, had also authorized the creation of the Rio Grande Mission Conference, the predecessor of the Southwest Texas Conference. And so when the first bishop of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference visited San Antonio, he was anticipating the first organizing session of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference in November of 1859. And he mentioned that San Antonio was an excellent staging point to begin the missionary endeavor to Mexico. So the first bishop of the predecessor conference of the Southwest Texas Conference already had the Mexican American and the Mexican population in mind, even before he organized that first session of the Rio Grande Mission Conference in 1859. So without question, even though Euro-American Methodist leaders had a desire to reach Mexican and Mexican Americans with the gospel, the former perceived the Mexican population as culturally, spiritually, and morally inferior to the Euro-American newcomers. When the first bishop of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference, which later became the West Texas Conference, when he visited San Antonio in 1859, he wrote the following about the two groups of people that he saw in San Antonio. He said, "The Mexican, with his old ideas, plans, and ways, all ancestral and superannuated, riding his donkey without a bridle, and peddling sticks and scraps for his daily bread. The inventive, headlong American, full of energy, his hopes always ahead of his business and his gains. The one, stagnant from the dullness of his nature and the misrule of his country, content to lie without aspiration or change. The other, strained in every muscle and stretched to his full height, looking out for the good time coming, and resolved to go and meet it if it does not come soon. In fine, this conjunction of peoples is odd, motley, curious to see, and fruitful of reflection." While with the bishop of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference having such a negative estimation of the Mexicans in this region, it's clear that the form of evangelism would be paternalistic and poisoned by prejudice. This prejudicial and paternalistic viewpoint notwithstanding, it is still important to note that the first bishop of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference had the Mexican population in mind when thinking about the mission. The first conference of the new Rio Grande Mission Conference, which was the predecessor of the Southwest Texas Conference, did give some attention to the Spanish-speaking at the very end of the session. In his book, The History of the Rio Grande Conference of the United Methodist Church, Alfredo Nanez states, "In the last session of the conference, a resolution was passed requesting that the general book agent to publish a catechism in Spanish language. And the conference minutes indicate that there were 4 appointments made to the Spanish-speaking communities, but 2 of them were left to be supplied for lack of of workers, writes Nanias. And I heard from talking with someone else that there were also German congregations at that time as well. In the conference minutes, there was listed the appointment of the Mexican mission in San Antonio, but that was to be supplied. And Thomas Rainey was appointed to the Mexican mission of the San Antonio River, and the Laredo Mexican mission was also to be supplied. Robert P. Thompson was appointed the agent of the American Bible Society in the Rio Grande Valley and beyond. So he is the first person appointed to go to the Rio Grande Valley, and I'm sure that he was distributing books in Spanish at that time. In 1861, the conference also sent a memorial to the General Conference requesting that a missionary be sent to Mexico. And partly because of the Civil War, Methodists in Texas lost interest in developing ministries for the Mexicans. Almost a decade passed before anything significant occurred, and that occurred because a Mexican in northern Mexico had become converted and traveled to Corpus Christi to learn more about Methodism in 1872, or 1870, and that was Alejo Hernandez. So to close this part of the talk, it's important to note that the very first annual conference session of the Rio Grande Mission Conference, which was the first name of the Southwest Texas Conference, organized in 1859, did give significant attention to the Mexican and Mexican-American people in the region. And we heard a little bit more about that from Reverend Fagan's talk earlier this morning. The initial means of outreach, oh yes, here you can see this is the fuzzy photo of the gathering of the first mission conference in Payne in 1859. The initial means of outreach to the Spanish-speaking in the Southwest and northern Mexico was purely evangelistic, especially with the Methodist Episcopal Church South. One of the persons to convert from Catholicism to Protestantism, as we heard from Bishop Carcaño yesterday, was Reverend Alejo Hernandez. He had been a seminarian at a Roman Catholic church, in a Roman Catholic seminary in Mexico. But he left that seminary because he found it to be aligned with the conservative elements of Mexico. And so he went and he fought with the Mexican army. And in his travels with the army, he ran into a book called Noches con los Romanistas, which is Night with the Romanists, which actually meant the Catholics. So this was a strongly anti-Catholic book that sought to prove the errors of Roman Catholicism and the truth of the Protestant tradition. And this book was filled with biblical citations, each citation proving the errors of the Catholic doctrine. And the book intrigued Hernandez, so he decided to go and find a Bible so he could verify the scriptural basis of this book. And that took him up to Matamoros and then across into Brownsville, and we heard the story yesterday from Bishop Carcaño of how, as he was walking by a Presbyterian worship service, he was enthralled by the spirit of the music, of their singing, and he had a heartwarming experience. So he eventually decided that he needed, somebody advised him to go to Corpus Christi. And he ended up at Corpus Christi, and that church gave him wonderful hospitality in the forms of William Heaton again and Reverend Alexander Sutherland. And I can't remember exactly, but Reverend Alejo stayed in the house of either Sutherland or Heaton. So they even opened their door for him. Yes, I'm sorry, I couldn't find. The photo is actually of Donald Sutherland. You can find the real photo in this timeline that Bishop Martinez gave you. I hadn't found that one. So, with the support of William Heaton and Reverend Sutherland, Hernandez was ordained at 1872 annual conference in Leesville, Texas. And we have a photo of the Leesville, Texas church, I hope, that also was taken by Bishop Martinez. So Reverend Alejo Hernandez was the first person of Mexican descent to be ordained in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And then he was appointed to Laredo and then to Corpus Christi, again back here. But he didn't stay long in Corpus Christi because the bishop then called him or sent him to establish Methodism in Mexico. So shortly after he was here, he traveled to Mexico City and he helped to start Methodism in the Mexico City area. Unfortunately, Reverend Hernandez became sick after not even a couple of years, and he had to return back to, well, he desired to return back to Corpus Christi, where he hoped that he could be healed, but unfortunately, he died shortly after he returned to Corpus Christi. So, when we think about Reverend Alejo Hernandez, he represents Mexicans and Mexican Americans who crossed the border back and forth to share the gospel with the Spanish-speaking, beginning from Mexico, coming into Texas, going back to Mexico to share the gospel in Mexico, and then coming back again to Corpus Christi, where he desired to spend his last days. He serves as one of our spiritual ancestors who risked much and suffered much for the sake of the gospel. Also, in the case of Hernandez then, the borders that Hernandez crossed were linguistic, they were cultural, they were religious, from Catholicism to Protestantism, and they were political and geographical borders. So another characteristic of mission also, in addition to crossing borders, as I mentioned, is institutional support. For Hernandez was sent to Mexico and supported by the bishop and by the mission board. Even before Alejo Hernandez in Texas, there was Benigno Cárdenas in New Mexico. But this is his signature. Benigno Cárdenas had served in Mexico and then New Mexico as a Roman Catholic priest. And Cárdenas had some kind of conflict with the Catholic bishop in Santa Fe. So in order to resolve that conflict, he traveled to Rome to ask the Vatican to make a determination on that conflict. We don't know the outcome of his plea in the Vatican, but we do know that Cárdenas returned to the U.S. via London, where he met an English Methodist missionary named Reverend Rule. And Reverend Rule had served as a missionary to Spain. So Reverend Rule somehow and Reverend Cárdenas met in England, and then Reverend Rule recommended Cárdenas to the mission board of the Methodist Episcopal Church. So Cárdenas met with the mission board of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they agreed to support a second venture to New Mexico with Cárdenas, as well as Reverend E.G. Nicholson as the head of that mission group, and the younger Reverend Walter Hansen. So Cárdenas was received as a minister into the Methodist Episcopal Church soon after arriving in New Mexico. Then he preached, after he arrived there, the first recorded Protestant sermon in Spanish by a Mexican in the U.S. in November 1853 in the Plaza of Santa Fe. Now, knowing that Cárdenas, the man who had left New Mexico as a Catholic priest in conflict with that bishop, was returning this time as a Methodist minister, well, that was just too much for that Catholic bishop. So, knowing he was going to preach in the plaza only 2 blocks away from the diocesan cathedral, the bishop threatened to excommunicate anyone who went to the plaza to listen to Cárdenas' scheduled service after the Mass. And there should be a picture of the Cathedral of Santa Fe. Oh, no. Keep going. Nope, I'm afraid we don't have that. I'm sorry. That came later. So he also kept, so then as he was beginning to preach, then the bishop had the cathedral bells ringing so people wouldn't be able to hear Cárdenas preach. But the people did gather anyway, and he did preach. And Cardenas continued to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ and visit in the area. After a few months, the two other Anglo-American missionaries, Nicholson and Hansen, for various reasons, had less success because they did not know Spanish. One of them didn't, and the other knew just a little bit. So they returned back east, leaving Cardenas by himself to continue the mission. With Cardenas alone in the New Mexico mission field, the board really didn't know what to do with him. And so the mission was discontinued, leaving Cardenas on his own there. But the Methodist faith continued in the laypersons who had been converted by Cardenas, especially through Blas Gutierrez. So when they tried a third time, they found New Mexican persons who were still worshiping together, lay persons who kept worshiping together, reading the Bible together many years later, based upon the seed work that Cardenas had created. So Cardenas represents those persons who traveled on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border. He even traveled to Rome and to England. So in the case of Benigno Cardenas, mission means facing opposition from others. Mission means journeying to different places. Mission means crossing several borders, from Mexico to New Mexico, to Italy, as I said, to New York and New Mexico. And mission means crossing religious borders by moving from the Roman Catholic to the Protestant tradition. And mission meant suffering by being alone in the mission field after Cardenas's two mission companions had left. And mission meant institutional support for a while, unfortunately. So next, let's move on to Reverend Alexander Sutherland. Reverend Sutherland was appointed the first presiding elder of the New Mexican Mission District of the West Texas Conference in 1874, when there was 5 churches composing this new district. 3 men whom William Heaton, a layman that I mentioned earlier from here in Corpus Christi, he went to Mexico and he recruited 3 Mexicans from there and brought them back into this area. And they were approved by the West Texas Conference in 1874 to help start this new Mexican mission district. So here's another example of crossing borders in order to advance the mission. Sutherland and the Spanish-speaking preachers from Mexico in the New Mexican district, they had much success. They had so many Spanish-speaking churches that by 1880, just 6 years after this mission started, the West Texas Conference created 2 Mexican districts, the San Antonio and the San Diego mission districts. The General Conference of the MECS had authorized the creation of a separate Spanish-speaking conference as early as 1878, but the implementation of the authorization did not occur until 1885, and there should be a map there for you to see. The conference was organized at La Trinidad Methodist Church in San Antonio from October 28 to November 2nd, 1885. And it had 4 districts, one in San Antonio, one in Monterrey, another in Monclova, in Mexico, and then another in El Paso. So notice that 2 districts were in the U.S. and 2 districts were in Mexico. So the very first Spanish-speaking conference of the Methodist Church did not have any regard for the U.S.-Mexico border. That's what is called transnational religion, where religion and faith transcends national borders and barriers. And in fact, we worship a transnational God. So now, 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. So now, let me have a moment of personal privilege, which is about Maximo Villarreal, if he is there on the slide. Okay, so I have gotten the call from the bishop that it is time for me to move about 20 or 30 pages forward. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to be obedient to my bishop. So there are many other persons I could talk about, people that I have included that I wanted to talk about. Among them, Bishop Minerva Carcaño, who was the first Hispanic Latina woman who was elected to the episcopacy, and also Bishop Joel Martinez, who was the first U.S.-born Hispanic elected to the episcopacy, and also Dr. David Maldonado, who was the first Hispanic who became a president of the first president of a United Methodist Seminary. So one of the gifts that the Rio Grande Conference has provided has been the gift of leadership for the rest of the church. And there's many other persons that I had hoped to share with you, but for lack of time, I'm not able to include them. So I'll move to the conclusion. So one of the slides here would say, which is also, I believe, from the Uniting Table, Conference summary. It says, in summary, the greatest challenge facing the San Antonio Episcopal area is reaching the growing Hispanic population in the largely untapped mission field around us. Unification will help position the new Rio, Texas Conference to meet this challenge. So I started this lecture by stating why it's important for us to appreciate our Christian history. But there's another reason to appreciate it. As we examine the history of the church, we can also gain insight into God's revelation to us. For example, migration. One thing that is certain is that human migration is a natural part of human history. Looking at the Old Testament, we see several instances of the Hebrew people migrating, beginning with Adam and Eve migrating out of the Garden of Eden, and with God calling Abraham and Sarai to migrate from Mesopotamia to Palestine, and later the Hebrews migrated from Egypt to Palestine. And then we know that there's many histories of migration within North America, beginning with the Asian population that migrated across the Bering Strait and eventually became the Native Americans. We know that the Spaniards migrated across the ocean to Mexico and then into present-day U.S. Southwest. And Anglo and other Euro-Americans migrated into Texas and other parts of the Southwest. And African Americans were forcibly migrated into the U.S. in this region. And more recently, we have seen Asians migrating into parts of this region as well. So migration is simply a natural part of human history, and it will continue in different ways throughout our history. And when I think of migration, I think of the Hebrews who left Egypt and settled in Palestine. And many of those persons who traveled with the Hebrews really were not the direct descendants of the patriarchs. There were other groups who went with the Hebrews. And as they traveled together, they adopted the identity of the Hebrews, of the patriarchs. So there was a variety of people who came together and became one people through their journeying together. And that, I believe, is what we are doing. Finally, let us also remember that the account of history of the Rio Grande Conference that I've tried to talk about is about mission. And mission requires crossing borders. Almost done. God crossed the border between divinity and humanity when the Father sent the Son to become God incarnate among us. This is the ultimate example of crossing borders for the sake of mission. In the history of our conference, we see that the U.S.-Mexican border was crossed and transcended within the first few versions of the Rio Grande Conference and other Spanish-speaking conferences. We see that Euro-American missionaries crossed linguistic borders by learning Spanish in order to evangelize the Spanish-speaking in the southwest of Mexico. We see that religious borders were crossed by Benigno Cárdenas and Alejo Hernandez and many others who left their Roman Catholic faith to become Methodists. And we see many persons cross the border from Mexico to serve as clergy in the Rio Grande Conference. So what we can learn from the history of the Rio Grande Conference is that we will continue to cross borders in order to be a conference in mission. In fact, we must cross borders to be a conference in mission. And the question we need to answer, both on the conference level, on the district, and the local level is, what are the borders we need to cross in order to be faithful witnesses of Jesus Christ? I suggest that those borders do not need to be international borders. I think that they need to be the borders that separate us from others who are different from us. Just as God crossed the border to be with those who are different from God. Amen.